All right, welcome back to part 2 of threats to biodiversity. I got to straighten that out a little bit there. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about, we just finished talking about pollution. The next thing we're going to talk about are called introduced species, or you may have heard the phrase invasive species. Invasive species are species that were brought to an ecosystem, usually by humans, and they don't belong in that. They're not in their native habitat, and if they were in their native habitat, they wouldn't be a threat. But in their new habitat, they don't have the predators that are supposed to be there, and so it causes their populations to explode. They might outcompete native species. A classic example is what this photograph is called, it's a plant that's called kudzu, and we see it a lot in the southern United States. Minnesota is just a little bit too cold to have kudzu here, but kudzu was brought over to the United States as an invasive species, and it has spread all over the southern United States. It grows on top of everything, and we have had to spend billions of dollars to try to control kudzu populations. So invasive species always end up costing us in the end. I'd like to mention 4 Minnesota invasive species, but I want to be clear that there are dozens and dozens of Minnesota invasive species. These are just 4 that have gotten some press of late. The first one is the emerald ash borer. It's a small green bug. It's only about this big. It looks kind of big in the photo, but it is attacking our ash trees, and ash trees are one of the most common trees in Minnesota, and so there's major efforts right now to try to stop the emerald ash borer. The next one is called the zebra mussel. Zebra mussels are sort of clam-like organisms, and they were found, unfortunately, in Lake Minnetonka, 3, 4, 5 years ago. They hitch a ride on boats as people are transferring boats from one lake to another, and then once their population gets started, it's very difficult to stop them. They are very sharp, so when people walk on them, it cuts their feet, so it's painful on beaches, and it just covers anything that's standing still. The next one is called the Eurasian milfoil. Eurasian milfoil is sort of a seaweed. That's what we would call it in Minnesota. And it just basically gums up our lakes. It takes over the natural seaweeds that belong there, and then can be a problem for boating and other recreational activities. And then the last one I want to make sure everybody knows is the bighead or silver carp, also referred to as Asian carp. The Asian carp were released accidentally down south into the Mississippi River during a flood. That's my understanding. I hope that's accurate. Anyway, they've been moving up the Mississippi River. They are actually a Chinese native species, and they like cold water. So they were not doing particularly well in the southern Mississippi. However, as they have been swimming north, the water gets colder, they get healthier, they reproduce more. This particular photo shows people in a boat in the background. They are from one of the natural resource government agencies. And what they've done is they've shocked the water with electric probes. And by shocking the water, it causes the fish to jump out of the water so that they can get a count of how many are invasive species and how many are native species. In this particular photograph, almost all of the fish that are jumping out of the water belong to the Asian carp species. And so that would be an invasive species. They outcompete Minnesota native species and other native species. They are headed north in the Mississippi, and it's pretty much assumed that they are going to get into the Great Lakes and then move into Canada. The economic cost of these carp moving into the Great Lakes and then into Canada is, again, billions, if not trillions of dollars. All right, I'm going to go ahead and talk about conserving biodiversity. So this is how we stop these threats to biodiversity. This is how we're trying to improve our biodiversity. Things that we can do. First of all, we can slow the use of our natural resources. Stop cutting down so many trees. Stop using coal and fossil fuels and all those kinds of things. So stop using up our natural resources. And then turning more to renewable resources like wind, solar, and geothermal. Renewable resources don't run out. You use them and they're still there. Obviously, sunshine doesn't run out. Sustainable use also is a way of conserving biodiversity. It just means reducing how much we use. So for example, if we're going to cut down trees, give the trees time to grow back. And then that's considered sustainable use rather than cutting them all down before they have a chance to grow back. Recycling, protecting ecosystems, all those things are examples of sustainable use. In addition, to conserve biodiversity, we can protect what are called hotspots. Hotspots are areas of the world where there's at least 1,500 species of plants because they make the base of the food web, and they have at least already 70% or more habitat loss. So we're trying to protect those hotspots. Related is in protection is called mega reserves. Instead of just protecting small areas of land, the idea is mega reserves are huge, gigantic parks that limit fragmentation. Now remember, fragmentation is when a highway goes through an ecosystem. So these mega reserves allow plants and animals uninterrupted access through enormous tracts of land, and they don't allow roads to go through it, so there's not as much fragmentation. However, in circumstances where highways do have to go through, like in the photo, that's in Canada, in Banff, Canada, some people who are working to conserve biodiversity have built what are called habitat corridors. Habitat corridors are like bridges or tunnels, anything that allows wildlife to pass over or under the highway, and they do a really good job. They've got great evidence. They use stop action, well, whatever. They use photographs. They take pictures every time an animal crosses over. And we know that animals use these really, really well. Okay, another thing that we can do to conserve biodiversity is to simply restore the ecosystems that have been damaged by removing invasive species, reintroducing native species, and removing sources of pollution. Another one is called bioremediation. Bioremediation is using living organisms, so like fungi, bacteria, or plants, to detoxify polluted areas. I'll give you an example. I live off of Medicine Lake, and off of Medicine Lake recently they produced this rain berm that the yellow arrow is pointing to, and basically the runoff from streets goes into this rain berm, and then the plants detoxify, or they filter out the runoff from the streets so that the lake stays clean. That's not enough to protect Medicine Lake, but it's a start, and so I'm sure they'll be doing more of that. Okay, and then the last thing that we were going to talk about with conserving biodiversity is called biological augmentation. This is kind of an unusual one, but it's still kind of neat. Biological augmentation refers to returning predators to degraded ecosystems. A real obvious example is returning wolves. Oftentimes wolves have been removed by humans because of hunting. They're afraid of wolves, but we know that wolves control deer populations, for example. And now deer populations in some areas have exploded. By returning wolves, we control the deer population. There's lots of other examples of biological augmentation, but you just need to understand that it's returning predators to help control other populations. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Have a great day.